The people of the UK have quite an interesting thing going on when it comes down to eating animals. Some, such as chicken, pork, beef, lamb, etc., have been so long at the dining table that they're barely even considered animals and are therefore fair game. Any of these meats can be served up in any condition, and the Brits will eat them with, if not no complaining, that wouldn't be British, then at least the minimum of light grumbling. The late night way home kebab is a Saturday night staple, and the less you think about what's in those, the better you'll feel. All that being said though, it was perhaps rather surprising when, in 2013, the Brits lost their collective minds after the certain food-related news hit the headlines. On the 16th of January, the Food Safety Authority of Ireland reported that, quote, beef burgers with traces of equine DNA, including one product classed as 29% horse, are being supplied to supermarkets by Silvercrest Foods in Ireland and Dalepack Hambleton in Yorkshire, subsidiaries of the ABP food group. Immediately, things got wild. No matter who you are or what you might do in order to be considered a Brit, there is one unbreakable rule that you must follow, and that rule is, we don't eat pets. Now, granted, horses are only really considered pets after you hit a certain tax bracket, and it would have been much, much worse if the DNA had been that of cats or dogs, but the story still filled the news for weeks and months after this announcement. So, how did all this happen, and how were the mostly animal-loving Brits tricked into eating animals that are almost pets? And perhaps, most importantly, what was done about it? Saddle up, ladies and gentlemen, and join us as we investigate the Horsemeat scandal. Before we get into any details, there is something that we need to clear up, though. If you were to go back through the news articles of the time, you could be forgiven for thinking that the sale of horsemeat for human consumption was prohibited by law in the UK, and this is not, nor has it ever been, the case. It's difficult to obtain, mostly because the Brits don't eat pets, so there's no call for it, but if you want to go out and find someone who will sell you a horse steak, then you can bring it home, sell it in your restaurant, make it into lasagna, whatever you want, really. Similarly, if you're a farmer and you want to dedicate a large portion of your land to raising horses for food and send them to one of the 3 available slaughterhouses in the UK that can deal with them, then you're quite within your rights to do so. The reasons, though, that hardly anyone does choose to do so are threefold. The first reason is that hardly anyone in the UK will purchase it from you for reasons that we've already made quite clear. Secondly, whilst you can send live horses overseas to be processed and sold, the whole thing gets complicated and expensive very quickly. According to the website of the Government of the United Kingdom, it's also legal to export live horses from the UK for slaughter if they have the necessary paperwork, such as a horse passport, export license, and health certification. However, this is not usual practice. Since 2005, all horses have been required by EU law to have a passport for identification. Horses born after July 2009 must also be microchipped. The passport must accompany the horse whenever it is sold or transported, slaughtered for human consumption, or used for the purposes of competition or breeding. It contains a declaration as to whether or not the horse is intended for human consumption. The purpose of passports and microchips is to identify horses and to record medicines which render them unfit to enter the food chain. Thirdly, it's just not really financially viable to do it. A horse needs a lot more space and costs a lot more money up front than, say, a cow, so if you're a farmer wanting to raise livestock, then there are far more profitable options. So, now we've cleared up that little bit of tabloid-inspired misinformation, let's have a look at how the whole thing actually panned out. As we already said, the news broke out on January the 16th, 2013, but here's a more comprehensive breakdown of the findings from the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. 27 beef burger products were analysed, with 10 of the 27 products, or 37%, testing positive for horse DNA and 23, or 85%, testing positive for pig DNA. In 9 of the 10 beef burger samples, horse DNA was found at very low levels. In one sample from Tesco, the level of horse DNA indicated that horse meat was present and accounted for approximately 29% of the total meat content of the burger. Of course, this was only the beginning, and the papers were chomping at the bit to whip up the public into a state of unbridled hysteria. Sorry, we won't do that again. The public, for their part, mostly acted as the newspapers hoped that they would. Almost overnight, Tesco shares dropped by around 1%, or approximately £300 million in overall value. Now, up to this point, we've treated this story with a degree of comedic flippancy, and we're not the only ones to have done this. Even to this day, a struggling comedian knows that they can at least get a light chuckle out of a Tesco lasagna joke, and many people still believe that the whole story was blown out of proportion, and it really wasn't that big of a deal. Quote, so what if people ate horses by accident? After all, nobody died or anything. The thing is, though, this story really was a big deal. Tesco certainly were not the only company who suffered. Aldi, Iceland, Lidl, and even Burger King would soon follow. In terms of consumer trust, the UK hadn't seen anything quite like this since the days of CJD. Perceived deception aside, though, there's another reason why horse meat is so strictly regulated within the UK, and that's because horses that are not destined for the dining table are often given certain drugs that are not allowed to be sold in human food. The most common of which being phenylbutazone, often called Bute. For those of you who are not up to speed on their veterinary medicines, here's a description from Google. A non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, NSAID, primarily used in veterinary medicine to treat pain, fever, and inflammation. It's most commonly used in horses, but is also used in dogs. Its use in humans has been largely discontinued due to severe adverse side effects. Although the public were assured that the mislabeled meat posed no threat to health, it would later transpire that a very small number of drugged horses had in fact entered the food chain. Historically, the UK consumer had mostly taken it for granted that if they got something from the supermarket, then it would actually be the same thing in the box as listed on the label. Now though, people started to question everything. If they couldn't even make sure that their food had the right animals in it, then how could they be trusted to ensure that, for example, food that said it didn't contain nuts might actually contain them? As confidence in British and Irish beef plummeted, there was yet another blow to the industry. Understandably, everyone was testing everything rigorously in hopes that confidence could be restored, and this testing revealed that it wasn't just horses masquerading as beef, pigs had been doing it as well. As far as numbers go, it was a far smaller problem, but when it came down to the levels of outrage, people had a genuine reason to be displeased. As we're sure all of you know, there are several religious orders for whom the consumption of pork products is forbidden, and being deceived by their supermarkets of choice was a pretty unpleasant pill to swallow. Very quickly, the story spread from headlines on newspaper articles to parliamentary debates. But in order to ensure that you keep watching and don't click off through boredom, we will not inflict upon you any actual transcript of these debates. But suffice to say, they boil down to 3 salient points. 1, how did this happen? 2, how can we make sure that doesn't happen again? And most importantly, 3, whose fault is it? So, with the promise of the then Prime Minister David Cameron that, quote, everything will be done to get a grip on a very shocking crime ringing in their ears, people said about the most important part of any good scandal, pointing the finger. For now, big companies were running with the line that it was not our fault, we didn't know, sorry about that, but as the then Shadow Environment Minister Barry Gardiner said in a rare moment of wisdom, if every petty crook could get off by saying I didn't mean to and I didn't know, then our criminal justice system would be in a very sorry state. Still, discovering the actual cause of the problem would unearth things about the meat industry that those trying to sell the stuff to the general public probably would have preferred to have remained buried. On the surface, it all seemed fairly straightforward. Almost all of the affected beef was made by the APB group, and more specifically by their subsidiary Silvercrest in the border area of Ireland. So, obviously they would be able to explain exactly where it came from, right? Well, the trouble is that ABP, which incidentally stands for Anglo-Irish Beef Processors, is the largest beef processing company in the whole of Europe. So narrowing down the source of the problem was going to be quite the task. Complicating the problem still further, the origins of pre-ground mince can be less definitive than those of, say, a steak. This may upset all of the burger lovers out there, but unless you buy a piece of meat from the butcher, grind it up yourself and turn it into a burger, then it's highly unlikely that your quarter pounder will contain the remains of just one cow. In fact, it's even worse than that. Depending on the size of the processing plant, it's possible that the beef in your burger, lasagna, spaghetti bolognese, etc. didn't even all come from the same farm. If we add into the mix the fact that ABP is owned by Larry Goodman, who, among various other things, is famous for keeping his business affairs exceptionally private, a good deal more digging would be necessary. 10 months later, The Guardian published an article claiming that they had a pretty good idea of what had happened, as the following extract indicates. This is a reasonably long quote, but we're giving it to you word for word just to make sure that there is no doubt that these are speculations of The Guardian and not us here at Scandal. The Guardian has discovered that the company bought some of its meat from a Dutch businessman called Willy Selten via a trader who could have been a source. Selten ran a meat cutting plant in the town of Os, south of Rotterdam. In May, he was arrested by the Dutch authorities on suspicion of fraud and false accounting when official tests on boxes of meat labelled as beef taken from from his factory found horse DNA in 21% of them. Polish workers for Selton, interviewed by The Guardian and Dutch TV, have claimed that they were cutting up and mixing horse meat delivered from slaughterers in the UK and Germany with defrosted beef that was several years old. So old, it was sometimes green. They had to tie towels around their faces to stop themselves being sick. The workers described out-of-hours shifts, paid in cash, during which they mixed the different meats, and said relabeling of horse meat had been going on for up to 5 years. It is just possible that these claims may have had some merit, as not long after the original news broke, Selton was forced to recall 50,000 tons of meat after they could not provide proof of where it had come from. Although the boss denied any claims of fraud, he did admit that beef and horse meat had been mixed, and even that some of the beef was definitely spoiled. However, he claimed that the mixing had only been going on for around 10 months, and that the spoiled meat was being prepared and cleaned for sale as pet food. Ultimately, he laid the blame squarely at the feet of individual rogue management, and that is pretty much where the buck stopped. ABP were not the only culprits. For example, testing would show that products made by French manufacturer Comigel and sold by Tesco, Aldi and Findus contained 100% horse meat and no beef at all. But in the end, only a handful of individuals were eventually prosecuted, with the most serious custodial sentence being around 3.5 years. None of the big retailers involved were deemed to be responsible, instead being labelled as victims of fraud. So, what actually came out of all this? Well, at least in the short term, people in the UK actually started to eat a little more healthily. A Which report from March 2013 found that 6 in 10 consumers had changed their shopping habits. 30% of consumers were buying less processed meat, and 24% were choosing vegetarian ready meals instead of meat ones. Although changes like this have a habit of reversing not long after the cause fades from the public consciousness, data shows that on average, people are still more likely to show an interest in just where their food came from than they were back in 2013. But it's impossible to know whether or not this was down to a broader change in society or a direct result of the horse meat scandal. As for actual systemic change, the government investigation into how it was allowed to happen in the first place and how it could be prevented from happening again was completed in a, quite frankly, astoundingly short amount of time for the UK. Published under the name The Elliott Report, the investigation made a number of recommendations, several of which were even acted upon, and these, according to a progress report published in 2022, include the Food Industry Intelligence Network, FIIN, a not-for-profit organisation to bring together a number of large food businesses to share intelligence on food authenticity. Secondly, the formation of a National Food Crime Unit, NFCU, and the Scottish Food Crime and Incidents Unit, SFCRU, under the FSA board. Since their inauguration, they have moved quickly from solely gathering intelligence to investigating serious food fraud activities across the UK. Thirdly, the establishment of the Food Authenticity Network, or FAN. This has provided a unique online platform for the sharing of huge amounts of information and training for those who test for and audit food authenticity. Whether or not any of these things have actually helped is very difficult to quantify, but there is one thing that we definitely do know. The fact that it took so long for the contamination origin to be found proved very publicly and in real time just how fundamentally flawed the supermarket supply chain really was. Whether or not it's truly that much better now than it was 12 years ago is still a matter of debate, but at the very least, it spread public awareness and showed the individual that it can actually be quite important to pay at least some attention to the origins of the food we eat.